and welcome. My name is Dave Itoto. I'm the Executive Director of Alumni Relations at John Carroll University and a member of the JCU class of 2000. Tonight, we are proud to offer a platform for dialogue and discussion about equity and, in the same vein, justice. Now, these are words that should be synonymous with a Jesuit education, and our alma mater remains committed to these values. But that doesn't mean we don't need to work at it. It doesn't mean that we can't come together as a community and grow. And all of you tuning in some small way, are demonstrating your commitment to learning, growth, and living these values. Whether you're from the class of 2019, the class of 1959, or anywhere in between, we thank you all for being a part of this important discussion. Before we introduce our speakers, I wanted to provide a little background on this programming series. The Alumni Continuing Education Series, or A.C.E.S for short, was established in the spring of 2013 by the Office of Alumni Relations in the spirit of lifelong learning. The program offers enrichment opportunities for alumni and friends through the expertise of members of the JCU administration, faculty, and alumni community. This year, for the first time, we've gone online. And with over 800 unique registrations for this summer series, it's safe to say our alumni have responded. And we're excited to introduce to you our presenters this evening. Megan Wilson-Reitz, who earned her master's degree from John Carroll University in 2010, serves as the Administrative Coordinator for Diversity and Equity at JCU, where she assists with the design and facilitation of programs for faculty and staff to promote a culture of inclusiveness across the university, as well as providing support to other institutional offices and initiatives for equity and inclusion. With her master's in religious studies, she also teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. And Tiffany Galvin Green, PhD, who joined the John Carroll community this past academic year as Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, oversees all matters of equity, inclusiveness, diversity, equal access, and prevention of discrimination and harassment. Previously, Dr. Green served as Assistant Vice Provost for Inclusive Excellence at Vanderbilt University. She also has industry experience, having been the CEO and Executive Director of River Region Human Services, Inc. in Jacksonville, Florida, where she oversaw 13 nonprofit locations and 200 plus employees across 3 counties. Previous faculty appointments include the Eisenberg School of Management at the University of Massachusetts, Capella University, Minnesota, Flagler College in Florida, the University of Utah, University of Texas at Dallas, and the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. Dr. Green holds a PhD in Organizational Behavior and MS in Management Organizational Behavior from Northwestern University and a BBA from the University of Michigan. Thank you both for being here this evening. And one final note, all are welcome to enter questions in the Q&A chat box, and we will get through as many questions at the end of the presentation as possible. And with that, I will turn things over to you.
Great. Thanks, David. And thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. We're going to start with a really quick poll. So Eric, if you could launch our poll for us, just to check in and see who's here and what your level of involvement in the work of racial equity is. So if you could take a moment to answer the poll. Okay. It looks like we've got most of our votes in here, so I'm going to end it and we'll take a look. So you all can see this, right? The poll. So it looks like we have most folks are here because they're curious about the work and want to learn more about it, which is what we're hoping to do this evening. So quite a few folks are currently actively involved in this work, and some are looking for ways to get more involved. So good. This is a helpful tool for us to understand where we are. And so I think we are going to just plunge right in, and I'm going to share my screen and turn this over to Dr. Green to talk a little bit about racial equity.
There we go. Good evening, everybody. I wanted to start out with just talking about racial equity and just making sure we're all on the same page in terms of definitions. There's tons of definitions out there, but I thought this quote captured nicely what we're talking about in terms of applying a racial justice and racial equity lens and perspective to how you get engaged in much of the important work that needs to be done, whether you're doing things at an individual level, at an interpersonal level, trying to figure out how you can do more equity work in your workplace, or perhaps how you can become more involved in your community. All of those things require being able to apply a certain perspective. And so this quote just captures racial equity being about applying justice and a little bit of common sense to a system that's been out of balance. When a system is out of balance, people of color feel the impacts most acutely. But to be clear, an imbalanced system makes all of us pay. And what's important to realize with this is that racial equity is both a process and an outcome. We can think of it mostly as an outcome because it's something that we're trying to achieve. Equity is when race, in particular, will no longer determine one's socioeconomic outcomes or other disparities that we tend to see, and everyone will have an equal opportunity to thrive. And that's certainly the ideal goal that we shoot for. But in order for us to think about the work of racial equity, it's more specifically a process. As I'll talk about on the next slide, you can think about racial equity and racial justice from digging into more deeper questions. Applying a lens of racial equity would mean analyzing data and information specific to race and ethnicities, or understanding the reasons behind disparities, looking at data and statistics and structural root causes of problems that are going on that are leading to systematic injustices over time. And naming race explicitly when you're talking about problems and solutions, so that it's not the word that no one wants to bring up. It's specifically talking about, so how is this, for instance, if we're talking about the current pandemic and COVID-19, what are the disparities that are existing specific to race? What do we see in terms of health outcomes? What do we see in terms of disparate access to healthcare, et cetera? And racial justice is woven into there with the same sort of lens, understanding and acknowledging racial history, understanding that a focus on how can you build civic, cultural, and political power to help those most impacted, but also incorporate the perspectives and views and the work of those that are most impacted into coming up with solutions. So what becomes essential is having a focus on race explicitly in terms of your understanding, and also having a focus on how much you are interacting, including those that are most impacted by injustices as you create solutions and sustainable work. So we have a short clip to share that it spans on this. That a lot of this work requires doing the work requires a lot of self work, but also requires approaching solutions in a collective nature, approaching solutions in partnership, asking and inviting others into your growth experience as well as into the conversation for solutions. I wanted to start with just looking at, this is the framework, a model that's going around a lot more on social media. You may or may not have seen it, but it comes from, or was modeled on, the work of Ibram Kendi, but apparently the medical profession, Dr. Andrew Ibram, created this particular framework or model to talk about sort of the work that requires to becoming anti-racist, which is highly related to, how can you become more active in addressing racial equity? And as many of you pointed out in the poll, you're sort of curious about how you can do more. A lot of what I'd like to talk to, or Megan and I are going to talk to you about this evening, has to do with thinking about the various stages and steps that are required. It's more than just jumping right in and becoming active in a collective sense, but it requires a lot of self-work and a lot of dialogue and conversations that we often, all of us, will shy away from. So this particular model offers up sort of what are some of the things that sort of keep individuals from addressing racial equity. There's the comfort and the fear zone that may have individuals stuck into, it's not really my problem, it's not really my place, I'm not a racist, so I know I'm not doing anything negatively against the system, which is really a binary approach of thinking it's I am a racist or I'm not a racist, when it's actually about, am I actively doing work to fight racial structures, racial injustices. It's not just an individual I am or I am not situation. Or we can get stuck in, individuals can get stuck in, well, I don't have privilege, I don't even understand what you mean by this concept of privilege. So unwillingness to learn, or perhaps even just staying in a performative realm, which is adopting slogans, retweeting, reposting things in other spaces, adhering to the movement in terms of terms, but not actually being willing to grow, being willing to do some more reflection, being willing to engage in the more uncomfortable spaces. So you have to come out of the fear and the comfort zone to really start getting to a learning space where you're recognizing the current and present problems of racism and the structural history, what I was referring to in the earlier table, and being willing to go more in depth, moving into more of a phase of awareness, willing to seek answers, emphasizing we as opposed to I or me, willing to engage more and interrogate things more, even question some of the things that you see going on. But you really have put yourself into a framework of how can I learn more about what's going on? And then in this particular theory, once you move from a learning zone, you move into the larger growth zone where you're actually starting to engage and look for actions. And how can I speak up? How can I promote and advocate? How can I sit with my discomfort, and what does that push me to want to do more of? Also, acknowledging that you still might need some more learning, but you want to do the work there. And this is a fine framework to start with and look at. But what we want to offer to you today is that this framework is still yet a little incomplete because it ends up being limited in terms of being systematic or step by step. It requires thinking that you first get out of your comfort zone, get out of your fear, then move to a learning phase, and then you get to this growth state as if it's an end point. And it's not an end state. Actually, the model needs to be a little bit more circular, a little bit more growth oriented, and realizing that growth is something that has to be constantly fed. Growth happens when you are constantly sort of re-engaging in, okay, I've gotten too comfortable with the set of ideas and the kind of work I'm doing, and I need to do more. Growth requires doing constant learning, and growth is something that is evolving and constantly changing. So we're introducing to you today a different kind of a framework to think about that we've labeled the justice tree, with a tree with a triple E, that it's an educating and engagement and effecting change model that becomes important and essential and cyclical, because this also recognized that you have to do some work at 3 different levels. You have to do intrapersonal work, in terms of within and reflection, interpersonal work in terms of conversations, and then more community level. So I'll hand it off to Megan.
Thanks. So we're really proud of this model, especially the fun spelling of tree. So I hope everybody's very excited about that. But what we like about this model is exactly that it really is a model of growth and it's organic. And I think that really is how we grow. That's how we operate, as our society isn't operating on a linear path. We're an organism as a society. And so just to kind of look at this model for a minute, that as we're thinking about, how we tackle the work of racial equity, what we're tackling is we're starting with self-education, we're moving into engagement with others, and then we're moving towards making change. And it's important that we think about it in that direction, educate, engage, affect, and then we repeat the cycle. We go back to education, and that's an important part of this model. And so, just like an acorn, what I like about this, if you think about an acorn, it's trapped in this like hard little shell, right? And when we are, when we're growing in this system that racism, and it's a racialized society, a racialized culture. And so racism has us sort of stuck in this shell. And in order to break out of it, we need to absorb warmth, we need to absorb water, we need to absorb, things like a seed does in order to break out of that. And so we have to be start absorbing different messages about the world than we might have grown up with. And we have to start, breaking out of the shell of the world that we've kind of inherited. But once an acorn breaks open, it's not automatically a tree. It's not like, oh, I'm out of the shell and now I'm done, right? So the idea is that the next stage in this process is this very slow growing stage where we're engaging and we're testing things out and we're fragile. And so, all of us, as we're growing towards more understanding of the systems that we live in, more understanding of our culture, that we have to be engaging with the world around us. That means continuing to absorb things just like a plant absorbs nutrients and water and sunlight and everything else, but it also means there's a give and take that happens there, right? And so in this stage of the process, it's really about engaging with others, showing up as our full selves in our multiracial communities, being willing to make mistakes, and working to become a full participant in these sorts of dialogues and relationships. And then the third stage is, we've grown into a tree, right? We're big enough, we can offer shade to others, we can support others. But in this stage, we're not done, right? Because the goal of the goal of this model isn't to get to a healthy tree, it's to get to a healthy forest. And so if we want a healthy forest, we're not going to arrive at some magical number of trees where it's like, okay, now we're done. The whole point is transforming the whole ecosystem, right? And so if we're transforming the ecosystem, it's like we're replanting the whole forest here. So once we grow and we bear fruit, then we have to take that fruit and plant it and help it to grow as well. And so sometimes that's in ourselves as we return through this model and educate ourselves about things that are new as we encounter new information. But it's also about gaining wisdom and power and capacity for the whole system. So that's why we like this model more than the linear model where it's like we grow and then we're done. And interestingly, just to mention, this feeds very well into or mirrors in a lot of ways the Ignatian pedagogical paradigm, which is common across Jesuit institutions, where unlike banking models of education, where the job of the learner is to receive information passively and then just store it up and just until they're full, like, oh, I have all my information, I'm done. The Ignatian model imagines education as dynamic and cyclical. And so we absorb information to give context to a concrete experience, and then we reflect on that experience in order to take action. And then we evaluate that action, identifying where we have to go next to seek out our context. And then we use that to inform the next set of experiences, reflection, action, and onward through the cycle. And so in some ways, our tree model is very much like our Ignatian tradition, where we see learning about racial equity and learning about justice as a process where we're continually cycling through new layers of growth And then we return to square one when we encounter new information or we have to process new experiences, but that all of that is the process of growth. And so the first thing we have to do is understand the context of the experiences that we live in, right? And so that's the work of self-education. But the early stage is a place where if we're not careful, we can get stuck. We can get stuck in our idea about who we are as good people. And sometimes that can keep us from growing. And so we can listen to our next clip, if I can find it here, from Dr. Dolly Chug. And she is going to talk a little bit about being good people. Tiffany, did you want to do anything else to introduce this clip?
No, I'll reference it back, but let's just, again, she's speaking about this clip. Let me make one short introduction. A lot of times when we do education about concepts that relate to working in race, dismantling discrimination, you'll hear, or you've probably been exposed to concepts of unconscious bias and being aware of how our brains will actively work against us sometimes to cause bias. And that's all comes from models that are known as bounded rationality, that we can only process but so many things at one time. And so our mind will have shortcuts to help us engage with information, which then turns into shortcuts about individuals, which can sometimes turn into prejudices and stereotypes and things of that nature. Expanding on that concept, the work that Dolly Chug has done talks about bounded ethicality, which has to do with the broader sense of how we're operating in the world, beyond just sort of how we're processing information, but then how we're also processing who we are in the world and how that can be a barrier to how we can become more involved in doing more work, or how much we engage in trying to learn more. So she opens up in this clip giving a little bit of discussing bounded ethicality, but she gives some concrete examples of how it can stand in our way that I think is a first step, an important step to being able to fully embrace education and any sort of self-awareness, is that you have to sometimes fight against some of the things that might have you bound from thinking that you need to learn or need to grow. I highly encourage you all to look a little further or look and watch the entire TED Talk, but by Dolly Chug, as well as it was mentioned in the chat that we are engaging currently in a community book read for campus to talk about the entire book of The Person You Mean to Be. But essential to being able to do any self-education, essential to being able to grow and engage in this work that can be challenging. It can be it requires a learning and a growth mindset. It can be uncomfortable. All of these things require us to move into a growth mindset and to move beyond binary distinctions of I'm either a good person or I'm not. I'm not a racist. I'm not an unjust person. It's a either or binary that is a false distinction, and to think more about being a goodish person, because that puts you definitely in a space where you recognize that you may make some mistakes. You can always learn more. You can always do better. You can always become active in ways that you weren't active before. For those of you, I think there was a considerable percentage that indicated that you're currently involved in work and want to think about doing more. Well, being a goodish person means that you're not just acknowledging the work that you're currently doing, but you're looking for ways to grow and expand and get involved in different ways and include different perspectives and people into that particular work. So educating yourself first requires a couple of different steps here that I just want to highlight. Or not steps, I'm sorry, points that I want to highlight. Colorblindness is one thing that you have to fight against. This idea that colorblindness comes at a cost, it's harmful. Saying that you don't see color doesn't actually help in a racial equity world. We must, and we can, and we're able, and we must talk about race and identities. Not only does a colorblind perspective rob us from seeing identities and recognizing experiences and plights and things that may be unique or different from ourselves. But if you are too prone to go for a colorblind mentality, that means you're blinding yourself to racism that's existing. You're blinding yourself to discriminating practices, discriminating policies, discriminating behaviors, systematic injustices that that are harmful to our entire ecosystem and society. Because you're refusing to see race, then you're refusing to see the racial inequities and blindness. So you cannot see racism if you don't see color. So you definitely have to move beyond the color blindness distinction. And a third point I want to bring out is that some of you may be highly involved or maybe even have lived experiences that fall directly in line with what you feel is experiencing racial injustices yourself, or maybe you're closely aligned or have been doing the work for a while. And so you're highly aware of a lot of lived experiences of those in marginalized groups. That's important data. I don't negate that but it's important to recognize that lived experience alone is not the same as education, because you can't possibly have a full exposure to all different perspectives that you need. You don't necessarily get the full depth of history as to where systems and policies and practices come from. And even if you are a person of color, you have one set of lived experiences that do not equate to all of the experiences that you may need to become more aware of to be able to do more fully engage in racial equity work. So those are 3 points to highlight. Megan, we'll talk about the next 3.
So, the next 3 partly are things that we've talked about already, taking responsibility for your own education. And I think that the important thing there is for those of us who have little or no lived experience of racism, or this is new information to us. It's important to realize that just because I might be new to the conversation, it doesn't mean it's a new conversation, right? There are a lot of people who've been doing this work for a long time. There are experts. There are people like Dr. Green who've gotten multiple advanced degrees in this work. They've been doing this for a long time, and it isn't just, and it isn't appropriate for those of us who are new to the conversation to go out and just say, hey, somebody educate me. There are people who've done the work, and so it's our job to go out and try to find the people who've already done the work and who are putting it out there for us and learn from them. It's something that happens frequently in people who are, I think, very new to the work, is that if they're, especially white folks, right, we go out and we look for our friends of color and we're like, hey, I've learned that there's a racism conversation happening, and I want to be part of it. That's no good, and it breaks relationships. And so we have to do our own work first. And then the last is to say, sometimes it can be really much more comfortable to say, I want to stay silent. I had a conversation with a family member just a couple of days ago who said, I don't really understand all this stuff about race, and I care about it, and I want to be a good person, and I want to do what's right, but I don't feel like it's my place. It's not my lane. I don't want to say anything at all. And she said, but then somebody told me that if I'm silent, that's a problem. She said, I don't understand. Can't I be silent if I want to? And what I said to her is what I'll say here, which is that when we choose silence, that's also a choice. And it's a choice in favor of the status quo. And the status quo right now is what's harming and killing people. And so if we are going to accept that the status quo is actively doing harm, then our silence is a choice in favor of that harm. And so silence is only a choice if we are willing to accept that level of harm. And so that's not a real comfortable reality, but that's what it requires in order for us to do the education that we need.
So the second phase in the model moves us to thinking about engaging. As Megan had pointed out before, we maybe have elevated ourselves to a place where we're ready to engage with others. I think what I really want to highlight is traditional models, or a lot of times people will jump and think they can jump right from educating and becoming more aware of the issues, and then jump right into activism and doing more. And how can I sort of go out there and get involved in the protests, go out there and get involved in some organizational work, go back to my places of employment and really start to speak out or look for ways that I can create more systems or more question the policies in practice, because I'm feeling a little bit more informed. It's important to realize that there's that leap that's being made there, and not enough time do we engage in some of where the actual tough work is. If you move too quickly into trying to do the work, you're going to encounter some direct conversations that have to be had. Some testing of, why do you think, these ideas of yours are valid? Why do you think our policies and practices need to be questioned? What is it, what is your purpose behind this work that you're trying to get involved with? So this important seedling kind of a stage that has to deal with how you're going to engage in the environment as you continue to grow. And so that means having some tough conversations about race. And those tough conversations mean, you're purposely going to get into dialogues that you previously haven't gotten into, and you're going to be aware of your purpose when you engage. So it's sort of purpose and intent, and always calling to mind, what am I trying to gain in this conversation? Am I trying to gain some more information? Am I really is the purpose of the conversation to effect some change, to call into question? Understand your purpose so that you can remain mindful. And sometimes your purpose may be to really be, if you're just coming out of the education phase, then it's time to do those conversations that may require you to do more listening. And learning from what you can listen and learn from others. While at the same time, you may have to also demonstrate, when you start to, as you've gotten some more awareness of injustices and microaggressions and discriminatory behaviors, then you might want to call it out. But sometimes you don't want to just be in a mindset of saying, hey, that's wrong. You shouldn't say things like that. This needs to change in our particular practice, because that sometimes can alienate the very partnerships that you're trying to build and the work that you're trying to do as we're trying to expand our forest. To go on with our metaphor here, is that you want to actually figure out ways to call out the behavior, but still call in the individual to do work, which means that you may start sort of acknowledging, hey, I don't necessarily think you meant that. You meant that to come out across as it did. What were you thinking? Where did you get that information? Look for ways to engage in further conversation, as opposed to just dismiss that I've got all this knowledge now, and now I'm going to do what I need to do or expand that knowledge for others. Also remember that oops and ouch moments will happen. And Dr. Chug made that point that mistakes are going to happen, and that things are going to go wrong, and you may say the wrong things, or you may step on some toes, and it's okay, because you're trying to become a better person throughout the entire process. You're trying to get better at the kind of equity work that you do. You're trying to grow. You're not static. And so I like to think of it as allowing yourself some grace and allowing others some grace as well, so that you're not too hard on yourself and as the oopses occur, and that you aren't too hard on others if you should be the one that gets ouched, gets pricked. So in terms of allies, Megan was going to talk about the fifth point.
Yeah. So, there's a lot being written right now for, especially when we're talking about racial equity work, we're talking about the role of people who are, not affected by whatever the particular kind of racism is, right? And so, for white folks, we are least likely to encounter that racism. And so, I want to speak specifically here to white allies and, to folks who want to be allies to people of color, that there are 3 things that we do when we're in the process. And I'm naming these because I have done all 3 of them in my own journey and continue to try not to do them. But the 3 rules are, first, there's no cookies for this work, right? And so by cookies, we talk about ally cookies, like, hey, you want a cookie for doing what's right? We don't get cookies for doing the right thing, right? For being not racist, right? Being not racist should be a basic level thing. It's just that when we live in a racist culture, being not racist is actually really countercultural, but still it's should be the basic level of expectation for everybody. So we don't get cookies for the work. And so we can't go around asking our friends, especially who are people of color, and our coworkers and our acquaintances, like, hey, I did this great thing. I'm wearing my Black Lives Matter pin, please praise me. So we have to be careful about cookie seeking. That's a really, really common thing. And, many of us are really guilty of it. The second thing is to get out of your own way. And so if somebody says to you, hey, you did a thing or you said a thing and it hurt, or it was offensive, or it was racist, or, whatever the thing is, get curious about that if you're feeling defensive. Why do I feel defensive in this moment? Is it because it's right? Is it because I have something else to do? When you get defensive, what that does is it keeps that person from being able to feel safe coming back to you and helping you to grow. And so when someone comes to you to tell you about something that you might have done wrong, that took a lot of courage for that person to step forward and say it. Don't get defensive about it because it will shut down the communication. And then the third piece is that allyship, sometimes, we have this idea that, we're going to be allies because we want to speak on behalf of others, right? We want to be voices for the voiceless, right? So sometimes you'll hear people say that kind of language. But the thing is that people aren't voiceless. They've been silenced. And there's a difference. And so if people have been silenced, they are not voiceless. They're being actively silenced. And our work is to help them speak in their own voice, right? Help get out of the way of those voices, not be the gift of, the person speaking on behalf of them, right? And so your allyship isn't a gift you're giving to other people. It's your own work of becoming a more whole person, becoming a person that you want to be, and being the person that the world needs you to be. And so it isn't about giving your gift to other people. It's about, this is actually a gift you're giving yourself. So for the next piece, I'm going to invite you to just take a minute to go into this quiz that we've set up. And this will only take a moment. But this is a good opportunity to, I'm going to put the link in chat as well here. This is an opportunity for you to consider your own role in social action, or in social change. So once we move from the, educate and we move into engage, now we're in this process of trying to effect change. Well, when we do that, what's our role, right? We're seeing a lot of people protesting in the streets, but that's not the only thing that people do or can do. And so this model comes from Deepa Iyer, who has become somewhat well known for this work recently. But her model imagines that we all have these various roles that are all contributing to equity and liberation and justice. And so if you could log into that quiz and just take a minute to, to offer your own thoughts. We'll take just a minute to do this.
So what we wanted to give you with this particular mapping is, well, this particular model requires for you to actually think about the roles that you play, and mapping is the term that's used. And so this particular link that you may or may not be finishing, or you can return back to, just gives you a little bit of a visual to think about in terms of where you fall on the spectrum in each of these roles, because it's not an either or system. It's not that you should think of yourself as, I'm clearly a healer, or I'm clearly in the realm of being on the front lines. It's some roles that you may be more or less comfortable, more natural at playing, and others that you don't give as much energy to. But then there may be some roles that you might think about that I really would like to become engaged in that particular way. And look at sort of, are you staying more in certain roles that are more comfortable, as opposed to things that ways you could be working towards change that might bring you more energy or bring more enthusiasm to the table. So one kind of question is to look at the mapping. There is a link on that same page that you can evolve into even deeper reflection. But here are some, 4 main questions that you can start to think about initially. Sort of where do I fall in terms of the different roles? What roles are giving me more or less energy? What roles am I often asked to step into by others? Or even the converse to that, sort of what roles am I often not looked at when people are sort of engaging in community activism and maybe no one calls to invite you? Is there something to be deemed from that? None of these are yes or no sort of binary answers. It's things to require you to do more reflection so that you can determine how you've been engaging in racial equity work, how you've been engaging in any kind of equity work, and what more you could think about doing. Thirdly, you may think about how do you move through the different roles, so that, again, you're not just selecting one, but you also don't want to sort of tap into any particular role lightly without fully educating again, engaging in the ways that we talked about, committing enough within each role that you are feeling more inclined to do so that you can truly be effective and effect change. So these are some ways to look at the mapping of it, that it really is a mapping process to think about this particular model. It requires a lot of reflection so that you can know areas that you need to grow and stretch yourself. And that's that last question: how can I stretch myself? Where can I take bolder risk? Especially if I hold different forms of privilege, and we'll come back to this topic in a minute. If I have access into certain circles and I'm not using that access in a particular way, if I can speak up when others are not being heard, am I using that in a particular way? And if not, what do I need to learn more about before I can stretch myself? What kind of conversations do I need to have? Again, all components of this tree framework that we're presenting that you are using to question and stretch and take yourself into new directions. A couple of other points to make about effecting change. Beyond mapping your role is thinking about leveraging power, privilege, and access. So we all have sources of power. We all have individual sources of power, ways in which we may be more influential, groups that we're very influential in. Sometimes it's within our families. Sometimes it's because of the position we may hold in particular networks, organizations we're involved in, the roles that we play in terms of positional power. But are you truly leveraging sort of places where you have influence to speak on these kinds of things? And so this is about realizing that, one, are you really using the spaces in which you interact, your networks, places where you have access, places where you know others have access to being able to make change, bring resources, time, money, energy? Are you using those opportunities to engage in this work? Or have you siloed this work to, oh, that's the work I do over here with this organization or with this group of individuals? Because then you're not really leveraging all of the true influence that you may have, and you're not engaging maybe as fully as you can in transformative change. We all have privilege as well. You may have benefited from things. You're benefiting by being in a particular space where those that need to, perspective that needs to be heard isn't represented at the table. Maybe you're not seeing full representation if you're in a board, or if you're in an organization, maybe you're not seeing full representation in the community meetings where we're talking about what more can we do for the community, but we haven't invited those from within the community into that particular space. So really considering how you're leveraging your power, your privilege and networks and that you have access to, so that you can be truly effective in the role that you're playing, and that you're using that particular role in as many spheres as possible.
And then once you use that role, right, then it's also about stepping into that role and saying, this is what I'm going to do with this. But making the decision isn't the same as actually taking action. And so one parable that I've heard is the question, you've got 3 frogs on a lily pad and one decides to jump. How many do you have left? Well, you might think it's 2, but actually it's still 3. There's still 3 frogs in the lily pad, because the one frog decided to jump but didn't actually get into the water, right? So deciding to jump and then actually jumping are 2 different discrete steps. And so making a commitment to an idea is one thing, but taking action on it is another. And that's why I say, we're thinking about moving from being allies to being accomplices, right? Actually engaging in the work. And when we do engage in the work, it also means practicing good followership. Now, we talk a lot at John Carroll about good leadership, but what we sometimes forget to talk about is good followership. So sometimes it's not our job to be the leaders in these spaces. Sometimes it's my job to step back and get out of the way and to follow the lead of the people who have the lived experience, have the knowledge, have the wisdom, have the expertise. And that's not me in these cases. And so sometimes it's about good followership. And then the last thing is, when we're talking about access for people, there's 4 stages of getting at, making sure people have access. The first is listening to the voices of the people who aren't at the table. And the next step is amplifying those voices. So speaking for them if they're not there. But speaking for people, we've already said, is not a good model, right? The next best, or the next step would be to invite them to the table. Use your position at the table to get people there who aren't there. But then once they're there, the last step is get out of the way and hand over the microphone. And that's often really difficult to accept, but that's good followership also, is passing the mic to the people whose voices need to be heard in this space. And then when we've done all of that, we start rebuilding our forest. Because remember, it's a cyclical model. And so even if we've done all of the things in this model, there's more work to be done. So it means going back to the beginning, planting more seeds and allowing them to grow.
And in often ways, it may also be inviting others into the table, sharing what you've learned, engaging in new conversations that you haven't engaged in before, inviting others to engage in conversations or to take part in what you're doing in terms of education. All of those are ways that you are building on change and realizing that it is a constant evolution and a constant growth process. So with that, we presented our nice little tree with a triple E model, justice model for you, and we're open for questions.
Thank you, Dr. Green and Megan, for an excellent presentation. I just wanted to say, you touched on it earlier for me, the notion of wanting to be helpful, wanting to be involved and engaged, and drawing people into that discussion versus being, almost like too afraid to say something wrong, right? It's great that there's this awareness and this dialogue going on. But going too far the other way might build up more walls from engaging with this discussion. So I appreciate the tactics that you discussed tonight to breaking down those barriers and drawing everybody into this conversation. So thank you for that. And we would like to open it up for questions. I'd now like to bring in my colleague, Eric Eichhoff, our Associate Director of Alumni Relations, who's been kind of running production on this tonight and doing a great job for us. And Eric has been monitoring the chat boxes. So Eric, I'll turn things over to you for Q&A.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks, Tiffany and Megan for being with us tonight. We've got some really great questions, and One that we got from a couple different places, both in the chat and in the Q&A, is about John Carroll. What are some things that John Carroll University is doing right now to help students, faculty, and staff build an anti-racist community? And then are there formal ways that is being ingrained into John Carroll's curriculum?
Well, those are great questions. I can speak specifically to, so as you know, I came on board in my particular position in late October, early November, which then created the Division for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, where we encompass the Center for Student Diversity and Inclusion, as well as student accessibility and now student accessibility services, and now Title IX. We started off with engaging in more training opportunities, or I can't call them training. Sometimes they're more workshop and dialogue opportunities, where we jumped off the spring semester with how to teach more inclusively and what it looks like to be inclusive in a teaching environment, specifically for faculty. All of this is a part of our RISE series, which has to do with raising, I always get my acronym bad. Our RISE series that has to do with increasing inclusion on campus, and we focus on skill building and education. So we've been doing a lot more educational efforts in terms of workshops that we deliver to specifically to staff and faculty. Engaging with students, and we have a longer tradition of work through our Center for Student Diversity and Inclusions that constantly has discussions, dialogues, invited speakers and guests that talk about tackling issues. And we had those in the spring as well, where we were talking about issues that we didn't know were going to be quite so timely, as we invited in discussions that had to do with race and police brutality and other kinds of issues. So we have systematic programming that's more for offering that students and staff can take advantage of. What we know we need to do is build in more formalized mechanisms. So for the first time this year, we did a requirement for some online diversity, equity, and inclusion training for all staff and faculty. And we got over 93% compliance, which means with the exception of certain staff that are not even full-time staff or faculty with the university, people have engaged with coursework to get introduced as a baseline to topics of ideas. That gives us some place to grow from and something to build on. Do we think that that's enough to just offer those kinds of things? No, we know we have to grow and build on that. And so we opened it up to students. Unfortunately, it ran right into COVID, and when we had to close and cease on-campus operations. So we'll be revisiting what we can offer to students. But in the fall, for the first time, our incoming students are going to be required to take a baseline diversity course as well, and we'll be offering it to all students again. Again, this is just to give us some common language to start from. We're doing a host of other things in terms of direct trainings. I've done direct talking to staff that wouldn't necessarily come, because the next stage of the work is inviting people into the conversation, but everyone doesn't come. So then you have to invite yourself into the spaces where conversations are happening. So that means I've been doing direct presentations at faculty meetings to directly discuss what's going on in certain classrooms, and there'll be more of that. I have things lined up to work with our athletics division specifically, with our police department specifically, and doing one-on-one engagement with each of our areas to talk about the needs and how racist practices as well as other inequalities show up in these different spaces on campus. In terms of the second question, in terms of how is it a part of formal coursework, that's another place that I'm opening up for engagement. And what are we actually requiring of our students? We have a heavy lens on social justice issues, but are they really getting exposed to social justice as well as racial inequities, as well as what they can do to become more aware of biases and discrimination and systemic inequities. So that means really looking at our curriculum and looking at our requirements and making sure that the courses that we offer, that it's not just a specialized course, that it is ingrained in all of in various different ways in which students may be exposed, so that every John Carroll student can move out and have had some exposure to not just the basics of diversity, equity, inclusion, but thinking about what it means to be actively involved in justice. That work is now, again, a part of what I'm developing in discussions with the provost and how I'm sort of building relationships with our deans of both colleges.
And if I could just add too that, as a member of the faculty for the last 10 years, I've watched our curriculum develop in some really exciting ways in that regard. We have social justice education as an explicit learning goal, academic learning goal. And that's something that's really somewhat unique to to the Jesuit educational experience, is that social justice is built into our curriculum design. And so no student can graduate from John Carroll without at least having taken one course that addresses issues of social justice. Now, we'd love it for it to be more. We'd like it to be built in throughout the curriculum. But at the moment, there is still this foundation upon which to build that requires, that they learn what we mean by social justice and what that means in this context. So it's a wonderful place in which to do the work because we have that mission grounding us.
As a staff member, it truly has been wonderful to see all the different resources that your office is working on and providing to our community. So thank you for your tireless work in that regards. We've had a couple questions on how to talk with people about this subject in racial equality, which can be difficult at times. How would you suggest starting? What ways would you suggest if you want to have the hard conversation with someone who just doesn't feel like racism is a thing, or United States isn't, our country's not racist? How would you help that conversation along? And then in a similar way, if it's someone that is a family member or maybe a professional that you work with, does that make a difference on how you have that conversation?
Can I start on that one? Because I think that for me, as a white person in a almost exclusively white family, I'm in all white spaces a lot, and I think conversations about race, I think for those of us who are here tonight who share that experience, I think some of you are probably nodding right now at your screens like, yes, that's the conversations that happen in white spaces are really different than conversations that happen in multiracial space. And so when we are engaging in these conversations, especially in a group, if you're at Thanksgiving dinner and you're arguing with Uncle Joe who says racism doesn't exist, there's no such thing as race, and I love everybody blue, pink, purple, and green. It's always purple and green for some reason. Have you noticed that? But when somebody says that and you start engaging that, you may not be changing Uncle Joe's mind. Uncle Joe may not be willing to move, but you have a whole group of silent listeners who are also listening to that conversation, and they are listening in order to be moved. And so I think sometimes I would encourage people to say, do your best and tackle it, and understand that you might not actually be moving the person you're discussing this with, but you might be moving the people around you towards more understanding and more education. And so don't give up on those conversations just because Uncle Joe is a holdout, because there are a whole lot more people. It's that 80-20 rule, right? 20% of the people are going to give you 80% of that time, but 80% of the people are also able to, I think, listen in and to be moved.
With that too, there's a whole host of, in lieu of time, what we were trying to do, in which will come out again, but in some of the links that were included, there's specifically materials that our offices put together, or we have found that help for sort of how to engage in conversations, things to be mindful of, how to call out. That means you may actually have to put yourself in a position that you may witness something or someone's brought to your attention, things that are going on. One of the things that that all of us can benefit from right now, even though it may feel incredibly, we're in a period of a lot of unrest and a lot of movement. Well, what the current conversation that's going on in so many different households that we're witnessing take place in front of our eyes in media and everywhere else is bringing up the fact that people are sharing more. You can see experiences being shared. You may even be in a place where someone says, this has been going on a long time at this office, and I really think something needs to be done about it. So you may have to sort of listen to those particular arguments and start to help others to engage. And that's an opportunity for conversation. And now it's not just sort of, it's never been coming out of nowhere, but it's very clear that people are aware that these particular questions, where it's coming from, because it's being talked about everywhere. So it's a prime opportunity to go, hey, I think I need to speak on this particular thing, and to think about, there's a couple of, again, there's resources that we've been on, sort of tips for starting conversations, tips for sort of how to remain mindful and the best way to engage. But then we also included another resource there on the difference between calling out and calling in, which really gives some actual language that you can use, that you can practice what's comfortable for you and what matches. There may be a way that you want to call out and call in your personal life that you wouldn't use in your professional life, but there's some other wording there that can give you a good idea, because we anticipated these kinds of questions to come, but we also recognize that it's kind of a one-way conversation, and we can't sort of do the one-on-one counseling that may be needed. But having a couple of tips, thinking about ways to engage, talking with others that are also trying to do the work with you is a good way to practice. And then you have to push yourself out there to speak up and to engage in conversations. And then another important point that I just want to say is that if you're talking about wanting to learn from others that are actually having lived experiences, you might have to recognize that they, just like others, may be closed to conversation. Everyone isn't ready. But as Megan pointed out, that sometimes speaking up has more to do with the other people that observe you speaking up and speaking out and having conversation. And the attempt sometimes will leave questions open that silence didn't do. So even if you feel you've had a conversation that didn't seem to make any progress, you've made a dent. You've made some progress more than if you didn't say anything at all.
Thank you for that. That's incredibly helpful. Another question. If I can bring my screen back up. Sorry, 1 second. All right, we have a question from MJ Hogan. What comments, concerns, and feedback are you hearing from our current students and incoming students, for that matter, about the ongoing social or national discourse that's taking place right now across the country? And then what are your expectations for our students when they return back to campus in the fall?
This is a good question, and we may not be representing, right now it's been we're in a weird space, right? So we've been off campus for a few months now, and we're incredibly overwhelmed. Students are incredibly overwhelmed with what is the next semester going to look like. Yet at the same time, I have seen some dialogue and some concerns and had conversations with students that want to know, well, what are they going to be walking into in terms of the racial climate? There's going to be a lot of activity. There's a lot of activity that's happening right now in virtual space. So there's a lot of comments that are going on about various issues that people are witnessing, and now they're wondering, when I come back on campus, I didn't realize that some of the people in my social groups had these kind of feelings. At the same time, others are saying, I didn't realize that some of the people in my social group want to do so much work. And so there's a little apprehension for some, and there's encouragement for others. But I anticipate that when we get back on campus, this is all going to become multiplied. So I'm trying to make sure that we're prepared as a campus, and that other departments are prepared for what that might look like, and that we get ahead of it in terms of discussions, having open spaces for processing, having open spaces for dialogue, and helping to be prepared to educate where needed. But again, it's hard to really get a good pulse on things, because there's a lot of anxiety going on. both about what's going on with our racial climate as well as what's going on with our national health and the pandemic. So the two together will make for an interesting powder keg, but hopefully not in a negative way, of activity.
That makes complete sense. It definitely is a interesting time that we live in. Just so many moving parts and so many different dynamics that are at play right now. One question I know those of us who have little ones will be interested in, and I love the justice tree idea with, you know, an oak producing acorns and building a forest. How would you advise parents to have these conversations? And then what resources would you recommend for parents who want to introduce these concepts to their little ones?
Well, we have a number of resources actually on our website. And so the website is, it's just, let's see if I can get it into the chat. I'll put it in the chat in a minute, but the website for the DEI division, we have a racial equity resources guide with a collection of different resources, and we have a whole section for families with children. And so families who are raising children of color and trying to explain what, you know, they're experiencing and observing and trying to help contextualize it for them. You know, white parents trying to explain racism to their white children. And so, you know, and everything in between, right? And so there's a lot of resources out there, some really excellent things. And so I would encourage parents, there's never, I think the important thing is to say, you know, and I say this as a, you know, parent of young children myself, that they're never too young to talk about these things. Age appropriate, yes, but there's never an age that is too young to start talking about human dignity, respect for others, justice, equity. Children understand justice, right? Anybody who's ever tried to share a cookie between two children knows that they understand justice. And so I think that it's appropriate to talk about those things with children, and there's great resources for doing so.
The other thing to also be mindful of is that these discussions are opportunities for, you don't have to be fully educated or aware on all issues to engage in conversations with younger family members, and definitely not with your children. This is an area and an opportunity to go to open yourself up to, well, what are you hearing? What questions do you have? And then go, that's a good question. We should look up some things together. I'm not entirely sure. It's okay to admit that you don't have the answers, and to look for resources and ways to explore together, which may, you know, at this particular time give you an incredible opportunity to watch something together and discuss your feelings of it. I had to personally engage with my son, and sort of, he was hearing a lot of conversation about George Floyd, but said, Mom, I don't really know who that is. And is that, you know, really thought, is this a celebrity I'd never heard of? Because he really just wasn't engaged in that way. So then that means we had to sit together and dig into some resources, age appropriate. He's a young teen, but it's okay to walk this road together, the self-education road together with your children. And I encourage you to do so. It's okay to also invite us. I know that there's a feeling sometimes that you may be excluded from the conversation, or that you don't know enough, and don't use sort of those particular blocks that society may be trying to put you into, or that you let yourself be put into, to be a reason not to learn more. You can invite yourself into any conversation. You just want to be wise about how you're doing it and understand your purposes. I'm inviting myself into this conversation because I want to learn more. I want to grow more. I want to do more, and not because I want to be heard, or I want to have my viewpoint heard, or I want to explain what I feel needs to be explained. You have to be open to invite yourself into spaces, but also approach it with what's also known as sort of a certain amount of humility, right? That you want to tackle things from, I don't know what this is about, so let me learn from what I'm reading, let me learn from what I'm seeing, let me go into different spaces and watch things I haven't watched before, and let me see what I can learn.
Well, thank you very much. We are about at 9:20. And we have a lot of other questions. And before we even hopped on, I had asked Tiffany and Megan if they'd be willing to answer some of the questions that we didn't get a chance to get to in writing. And we will make that available. We are recording this. I know we've seen some comments about, are we recording this? We are. We will send it out to everyone who registered for this webcast as well. So again, Tiffany and Megan, thank you so much for being with us tonight. I will now turn over to Dave for some final comments.
Thanks, Eric. And again, thank you, Dr. Green. Thank you, Megan, for a wonderful evening. And I'd just like to close things out by plugging our upcoming webinars here yet to come in the month of July. Coming up on July 7th, right after the holiday weekend, we will address the political impact of COVID-19 with Professor Colin Swearingen from the Political Science Department at John Carroll University. That webinar is at 8 p.m., again on Tuesday, July 7th. Toward the end of July, on July 21st, we'll take a look at the role of the media in today's society. That will be with Professors Peggy Finucane and Brent Brosman, and journalist Andrew Rafferty from the class of 2009. Again, Tuesday, July 21st at 8 p.m. And finally, as an offshoot of our A.C.E.S program, we are launching JCU Junior on July 13th. This week-long enrichment program is geared toward the youngest members of our Blue Streak family, the children of our alumni, faculty, staff, and friends. All are invited to learn about space exploration and science, poetry, animals, and baking favorite recipes from the kitchen. We also intend to open this program up to the greater Cleveland community and surrounding school systems, exposing children throughout Northeast Ohio to John Carroll. And as a reminder, registration for all of these JCU alumni programs is free. Visit jcu.edu/alumni or follow us on social media at JCU Alumni for more details. Thank you all again, and God bless.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you.